19th century European royalty had a golden rule. Kings only married princesses. But Frederick VII of Denmark was never good at adhering to it. Instead of choosing a wife of equal social standing, he married a milliner and former ballet dancer, Louise Rasmussen, and created her Countess Danner. Imagine the shock across the continent when a commoner with a complicated romantic past ascended to the highest position in the kingdom. The nobility called it a national disgrace. But Frederick called it true love, a king addicted to alcohol, with a volatile temperament, willing to abandon all royal protocol to live like a carefree peasant with his infamous wife. This is the story of Frederick VII, the most debauched king in history, who proved that sometimes chaos is the only cure for a lonely heart. Some details survive as rumor, others as documents. We'll separate what's recorded from what's whispered. Because in monarchies, the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's a signature. To unravel the paradox of how a monarch could fall so far from the tree of tradition, yet land so deeply in the hearts of his people, we must look past the scandals and the headlines. We must look at the boy who was broken long before he ever wore a crown. For Frederick VII was not born a rebel. He was made one by a childhood tragedy that defined his entire existence. Psychologists often say that the child is the father of the man. If that is true, then Frederick never stood a chance. He was born in 1808 into a golden cradle that was sitting on a fault line. His father was Prince Christian, a man of high intellect and immense ambition. His mother was Charlotte Frederica, a vibrant, impulsive woman who loved parties and hated rules. For a year, they were the golden couple of the North, but the marriage was a sham. When Frederick was just an infant, the scandal exploded. His mother was accused of having an affair with her singing teacher, a French composer named Edouard Dupuy. The retribution was swift and brutal. In the Danish court of the early 1800s, you didn't just get a divorce, you got erased. Charlotte Frederica was banished. She was sent to a palace in Jutland, forbidden from ever seeing her son again. Little Frederick was 1 year old. He was ripped from his mother's arms and handed over to a father who viewed him less as a son and more as a state asset. He never saw his mother again. She died decades later in Rome, a lonely, eccentric exile. This primal wound, the disappearance of the mother, defined Frederick's entire emotional life. He grew up in a palace full of servants, but empty of love. His father, Christian, was a man of the Enlightenment, which is a polite way of saying he was cold, intellectual, and critical. He looked at his son and saw a disappointment. Frederick wasn't book smart. He wasn't interested in science or philosophy. He was a physical child, loud, clumsy, and desperate for attention. Instead of affection, he got discipline. He was handed over to tutors who were instructed to mold him into a prince. But you cannot mold water. Frederick resisted. He acted out. He learned early on that he couldn't compete with his father's intellect, so he stopped trying. He found solace elsewhere, in the stables, in the kitchens, with the people who were paid to be there. He realized that the servants didn't judge him. To a groom or a cook, he wasn't the disappointing prince. He was just a lonely boy who needed a laugh. This was the seed of his populism. He didn't love the common people out of political theory. He loved them because they were the only ones who treated him like a human being. By the time he was a teenager, the eccentricity was already manifesting. He was restless. He couldn't sit still. He had a strange barking laugh, and he had discovered the magic of the bottle. Alcohol wasn't just a drink for Frederick. It was a shield. It made the boring court dinners bearable. It made his father's judgmental stare blurry. It made him feel, for a few hours, like the king of his own life. In the 1820s, the royal family decided that something had to be done. The prince was feral. He needed finishing. So in a move that feels strikingly modern in its misguided optimism, they sent him away to boarding school. But not just any school. They sent him to Geneva, Switzerland. The idea was to expose him to the refined air of French culture and Calvinist discipline. It was a disaster. Instead of turning him into a gentleman, Geneva introduced him to freedom. For the first time, he was away from the suffocating atmosphere of Copenhagen. He was surrounded by young men who were interested in gambling, women, and wine. Frederick flourished, but not in the way his father hoped. He became the life of the party. He developed a taste for low culture. He didn't want to discuss Voltaire. He wanted to play cards and hear dirty jokes. He learned that his title opened doors, but his personality, loud, generous, chaotic, kept people in the room. But there was a darkness growing in Geneva too. The drinking moved from social to medicinal. Observers noted that the prince seemed to lack an off switch. When he was happy, he was manic. When he was sad, he was despondent. Today, we might look at his behavior, the mood swings, the impulsivity, the substance abuse, and wonder about accounts suggest or perhaps the long-term effects of childhood neglect. In the 19th century, they just called it weakness of character. When he returned to Denmark, he was a man-child. He was physically robust. He had the barrel chest of the Oldenburgs, but emotionally, he was stunted. He was terrified of his father. King Frederick VI and Prince Christian looked at him with growing alarm. The line of succession depended on this boy. He needed to settle down. He needed a wife. And so the machinery of the state began to grind. They needed a sacrificial lamb, a princess perfect enough to fix him. They chose Wilhelmina Marie. On paper, it was the perfect match. Wilhelmine Marie was the daughter of the reigning king, Frederick VI. She was Frederick's second cousin. She was sweet, pious, and incredibly dull. The dynastic logic was sound. By marrying the king's daughter, Frederick would unite the two lines and secure the throne. The wedding in 1828 was the event of the decade. Copenhagen was lit up with fireworks. Crowds cheered. The poets wrote odes to the young couple. Everyone wanted to believe in the fairy tale. They wanted to believe that marriage would tame the wild prince. It took about a week for the fairy tale to turn into a horror story. Wilhelmina was unprepared for the reality of Frederick. She expected a chivalrous knight. She got a drunk who smelled of stale tobacco and dogs. Frederick, for his part, felt trapped. He had been forced into this marriage to please his father and the king. He resented Wilhelmina not because she was a bad person, but because she represented the cage. The marriage disintegrated almost immediately. Frederick didn't just ignore his wife, he humiliated her. He continued his bachelor lifestyle. He disappeared for nights on end, found in the brothels of Copenhagen, or drinking in the barracks with the soldiers. When he was home, he was erratic. There are dark rumors from this time, whispered in the letters of courtiers. Rumors of violence. Frederick had a temper that could snap like a dry twig. He would fly into rages over nothing, a cold cup of coffee, a missing button. Wilhelmina was terrified of him. She was a delicate flower being stomped on by a bull. The king, Frederick VI, was furious. He loved his daughter, and he saw what the prince was doing to her. He tried to intervene. He lectured Frederick. He threatened him. But Frederick was past the point of listening. He was spiraling. The alcohol consumption was now enormous. He was rarely sober after noon. In 1834, the unthinkable happened. The king granted a separation. In the royal world, divorce was a nuclear option. It was an admission of total failure. But Frederick VI could not stand to see his daughter suffer anymore. The marriage was dissolved. She recovered and later remarried, yet the scandal of that first marriage never fully faded. And Frederick, he was punished. The king exiled him. He was sent to Fredericia, a fortress town in Jutland. It was meant to be a prison without bars. He was stripped of his household, removed from the capital, and told to rot. The court hoped that the isolation would break him, or perhaps that he would drink himself to death quietly, far away from the public eye. But a strange thing happened in Fredericia. The punishment became his liberation. Stripped of the pomp of Copenhagen, Frederick stopped pretending. He didn't have to be the prince here. He was just the commander of the local regiment. He fell into a rhythm that suited him perfectly. He would wake up, inspect the troops, go hunting, and then spend the evenings hosting dinners that were legendary for their lack of etiquette. He invited the local merchants, the officers, the town notables. He didn't care about their pedigree. He cared if they could tell a good story. He became the king of Jutland. The people of Fredericia saw a side of him that the court never saw. The liberals were demanding an end to absolute monarchy. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were on the brink of revolt. The country needed a strong, steady hand. Instead, they got Frederick, a man who was hungover, anxious, and terrified of the responsibility that had just been dumped on his lap. He stood on the balcony of Christiansborg Palace, looking down at the sea of faces. He was the absolute monarch, the autocrat sent by God. But he didn't feel like a god. He felt like a fraud. Inside the palace, the old ministers were panic-stricken. They tried to tell him to be firm, to crush the liberals. But Frederick had a different voice in his ear, Louise. And he had his own instincts, the instincts of the outcast who felt more comfortable with the mob than with the ministers. As the crowds gathered chanting for a constitution, Frederick made a decision that shocked the world. He didn't call the army. He didn't fire the cannons. He turned to his ministers, shrugged his heavy shoulders, and effectively said, "Fine, give them what they want. I just want to go home and smoke my pipe." The morning of March 21st, 1848, dawned gray and tense over Copenhagen. The air didn't smell of the sea, it smelled of revolution. In the streets, thousands gathered in the streets, demanding the end of absolutism. They were lawyers, merchants, students, and artisans, marching toward Amalienborg Palace with a single demand: the end of absolute monarchy. Inside the palace, King Frederick VII sat in his chambers, likely nursing a hangover, surrounded by terrified ministers who saw the guillotine in every shadow. They looked at the king and saw a man who was barely holding himself together, a man whose hands shook, whose eyes were bloodshot, and who seemed more interested in his pipe than in the fate of the dynasty. But history is often shaped by the lethargy of the powerful rather than their strength. A different king, a tyrant like his ancestor Frederick VI, or an intellectual like his father Christian VIII, might have ordered the hussars to charge. They might have turned the cobblestones red to protect the divine right of kings. He wasn't chasing ideology. He was chasing relief. He looked at the vast crowd outside his window, then at his pale-faced advisors, and uttered the words that would make him immortal. Later anecdotes paint him as almost comically relieved, more eager for peace than for power. What matters is the outcome. He yielded, and Denmark moved toward constitutional rule. It was the most anticlimactic revolution in European history, and yet it was a masterpiece of accidental genius. By surrendering without a fight, Frederick didn't lose his throne, he secured it. But it's worth keeping the timeline straight. 1848 opened the door, and the legal break came the next year, on the 5th of June, 1849, when he signed Denmark's constitution. In an instant, the drunk prince, who had been the laughing-stock of the court, was transformed into Frederick the Giver. The crowd went wild. They didn't storm the palace to drag him out. They cheered until their throats were raw. They carried him on their shoulders, metaphorically and almost literally, as the father of the new Denmark. This transformation from pariah to idol was a psychological shock for Frederick. For his entire life, he had been the disappointment, the problem child. Now suddenly, he was the hero. He was loved. And for a man with Frederick's deep-seated insecurities, that love was a drug more potent than any schnapps. He became addicted to the adulation of the mob. He realized that as long as the people cheered, the snobs in the aristocracy couldn't touch him. He had found his protection. But while the people cheered for the Constitution, a darker storm was brewing in the south. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, predominantly German-speaking, and caught up in the nationalist fervor sweeping across the German states, revolted. They wanted to break away from the Danish crown. This wasn't just a political dispute, it was war. The First Schleswig War gave Frederick a new role to play, the soldier king. It was a role he was born for, or at least a role he could act out perfectly. He didn't understand strategy. He couldn't read a map to save his life, but he looked magnificent on a horse. He had the booming voice, the barrel chest, and the total lack of fear that comes from a combination of bravery and intoxication. He traveled to the front lines, dragging his entourage with him. The generals were horrified. They were trying to fight a modern war against the Prussians and the rebels, and suddenly the king would show up, red-faced and boisterous, demanding to inspect the troops or handing out cigars. He would wander into the trenches, ignoring the artillery fire, treating the whole thing like a glorious pheasant hunt. The soldiers, however, adored him. To a conscript shivering in the mud, seeing the king himself not hiding in a palace but standing there in the rain, they saw a man who was generous to a fault. If a soldier was in debt, Frederick paid it. If a widow was starving, Frederick sent food. Was this altruism? Or was it a desperate need to be liked? Probably both. Frederick had a gaping hole in his soul where his parents' love should have been. He tried to fill it with the applause of the crowd, and it worked. The people loved him. They called him Frederick Folkekær. While the nobles in Copenhagen sneered at his vulgar habits, the common people saw a prince who wasn't afraid to get his boots muddy. They saw a prince who spoke Danish. They saw a mirror of themselves, flawed, earthy, and warm. But the drinking didn't stop. If anything, it got more ingrained. It was part of his persona now. He was the drinking buddy of the nation. But privately, the demons were scratching at the door. He suffered from nerves. He would have days where he couldn't get out of bed, paralyzed by a nameless dread. He was lonely. In 1837, the state decided to try again. The heir needed an heir. One divorce was a scandal. No heir was a crisis. They went shopping for another wife. This time, they looked to Germany. Princess Caroline Marianne of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was 20 years old, beautiful, and utterly doomed. Frederick, now approaching 30, agreed to the marriage with a shrug. He needed the money that came with the dowry, and he hoped vaguely that maybe this time it would be different. Maybe a beautiful wife would cure the loneliness. It was worse, much worse. Caroline Marianne was a spirited woman. She didn't have the meekness of Wilhelmina. When Frederick came to bed drunk, she locked the door. When he ignored her, she complained. The palace became a war zone. Frederick's behavior during this second marriage crossed the line from eccentric to pathological. He was paranoid. He accused her of spying on him. He would wake the household up in the middle of the night, convinced the palace was on fire. The co-conspirator in his misery was always the bottle. The court watched in horror as the prince physically deteriorated. His face became bloated. His hands shook until he had his morning draft. He was a functional alcoholic, but the functional part was slipping. And then, amidst the wreckage of his second marriage, the event occurred that would change his life and Danish history forever. It sounds like the plot of a bad romance novel. The prince, trapped in a loveless marriage, looking out the window of his palace, sees a beautiful woman. Her name was Louise Rasmussen. She was not a princess. She was a nobody. She had been born out of wedlock to a maid. She had clawed her way up from the gutter. She had been a student at the Royal Ballet School, a place that, in the 19th century, was often a polite recruiting ground for royal mistresses. But Louise wasn't just a pretty face. She was tough. She had worked in a fashion shop. She had been a milliner. She knew the value of $1, and she knew the nature of men. Louise was everything the princesses were not. She was real. She was grounded. She wasn't afraid of Frederick's temper. When he screamed, she didn't cry. She screamed back. When he was drunk, she didn't faint. She put him to bed and made him drink water. They met, likely through an intermediary, or perhaps, as the legend goes, by chance. But the connection was electric. For Frederick, Louise was oxygen. She didn't care about protocol. She didn't care about his lineage. She cared about him. She saw the frightened boy inside the bloated king. She became his mistress. But she was more than that. She became his nurse, his mother figure, and his gatekeeper. She understood his psychology better than any doctor. She knew that his rages were born of fear. She knew that his drinking was born of loneliness. By 1846, Frederick's second marriage had imploded. Caroline Marianne fled back to Germany, telling tales of a husband who was practically insane. The divorce was finalized. Frederick was now twice divorced, heirless, and widely considered a disgrace to the monarchy. The respectable people of Copenhagen whispered that the crown prince was unfit to rule. They hoped he would die before his father. But Louise Rasmussen was there. She moved into the shadows of his life. She began to organize his chaotic existence. She limited his drinking, not stopping it, but managing it. She created a domestic sphere where he could feel safe. And then the clock ran out. In January 1848, King Christian VIII died. The news swept through Copenhagen like a chill wind. The intellectual king was dead. The drunk prince was now His Majesty, King Frederick VII. The timing could not have been worse. It was 1848, the year of revolutions. All over Europe, thrones were burning. In Paris, Berlin, Vienna, the people were rising up, demanding constitutions, demanding freedom. Denmark was a tinderbox. Cracking jokes and sharing a bottle was electrifying. He became Frederick Folkekær in earnest. He created a bond with the common soldier that no politician could break. He was their king. He was messy, he was loud, he was flawed, just like them. But back in Copenhagen, the fairy tale of the soldier king was colliding with the reality of his private life. While Frederick was playing the hero, he was also engaged in a domestic war that was far more vicious than the one on the battlefield. The target of this war was the woman who held his hand when the nightmares came, Louise Rasmussen. The establishment, the nobility, the old money, the high-ranking officers hated Louise with a venom that is hard to comprehend today. It wasn't just that she was a commoner. It was that she was that kind of commoner. She was a woman who had worked for a living. She had been a milliner. She had been on the stage. She had a past. In the rigid class structure of 19th century Denmark, she was dirt. They called her the milliner, the whore, or simply that woman. They snubbed her at every turn. When Frederick hosted dinners, the aristocratic wives would refuse to attend if Louise was present. They would look through her as if she were a window pane. They whispered that she was a witch who had ensnared the king with dark arts, or a spy working for foreign powers. Frederick's reaction to this snobbery was volcanic. You could insult his policies. You could insult his intelligence. But if you insulted Louise, you were dead to him. He viewed the attacks on her as attacks on himself. He saw her as the only person who truly loved him for him, not for the crown. When the aristocracy rejected her, they were rejecting him. This conflict came to a head in the most spectacular fashion. Frederick decided that being his mistress wasn't enough. He wanted to marry her. The government was paralyzed with horror. A king could not marry a commoner. It was against the Congoloven. It would destroy the dynasty. It would make Denmark the laughingstock of Europe. The ministers begged him to reconsider. They offered compromises. Keep her as a mistress. Give her money. Just don't put a ring on her finger. Frederick's response was simple. If I cannot have her, I will not be king. It was the ultimate ultimatum. He was ready to abdicate, to throw away the crown he had just saved for the sake of the milliner. The government, terrified of losing the popular constitution giver in the middle of a war, folded. They agreed to a compromise, a morganatic marriage. Louise would be his wife, but she would not be queen. Her children, if she had any, would not inherit the throne. On August 7, 1850, in the chapel of Frederiksborg Palace, the King of Denmark married Louise Rasmussen. It was a small private ceremony. No foreign royals attended, no cheering crowds, just a few loyal friends and a very nervous priest. To elevate her status, Frederick granted her a title. She was no longer Louise the milliner. She was Countess Danner. He thought the title would protect her. He thought it would force the court to respect her. He was wrong. The title Countess Danner became a punchline in the drawing rooms of the elite. To them, it was like putting a diamond necklace on a pig. It didn't change what she was. It just made her look ridiculous. The isolation of the couple began in earnest. Frederick and Louise retreated from the hostile atmosphere of Copenhagen. They bought a secluded estate, Jägerspri's castle, and turned it into their fortress. There, they created their own court, a court of the outcasts. This alternative court was a bizarre, chaotic, and wonderfully human place. Since the dukes and counts wouldn't visit, Frederick invited the people who would. The guest list at Jägerspris was a carnival of eccentrics, horse traders, circus performers, old soldiers, retired ballet dancers, and sycophants who knew that the way to the king's wallet was through his wife. Life at Jägerspris was a strange parody of royal existence. Dinner was served whenever the king felt like it. The dress code was whatever fits. The alcohol flowed like the sound. Frederick would spend his days pursuing his hobbies, which were as eccentric as he was. He became obsessed with archaeology. He would dig up ancient burial mounds, convinced he was a great scholar. He would dress up in the armor of his ancestors and stomp around the castle, swinging a sword at imaginary enemies. And managing it all was Countess Danner. Louise was the steel spine of the household. She had to be. Frederick's mental state was deteriorating. The nerves that had plagued him since youth were getting worse. He had hallucinations. He would wake up screaming that the Prussians were under the bed. He would have fits of paranoia where he believed his ministers were trying to poison him. Louise was the only one who could talk him down. She managed his drinking. She watered down his schnapps. She signaled to the servants when it was time to cut him off. She shielded him from the worst of the abuse coming from the capital. She was his gatekeeper, his nurse, and his mother. But power does strange things to people, and Louise was not a saint. The hatred of the aristocracy had hardened her. She became vindictive. She used her influence over the king to settle scores. If a politician had snubbed her in 1848, he would find himself fired in 1852. She began to interfere in state affairs, not out of political conviction, but out of spite. She became the Lady Macbeth of the Danish court, or at least that is how the newspapers portrayed her. The tragedy of their situation was that they were trapped. They were the most powerful couple in the land, yet they were social lepers. They had the love of the common people, who saw their marriage as a romantic fairy tale of the king and the Cinderella. But they were despised by the people they actually had to work with. As the 1850s wore on, the contrast between the public king and the private wreck became harder to hide. Frederick would appear at state openings, looking bloated and red, slurring his speech. Louise would sit in the gallery, covered in jewels that were too big and dresses that were too bright, staring down the whispering courtiers with eyes of flint. The scandalous eccentric was no longer just a funny nickname. It was a geopolitical liability. The question of the succession was looming. Frederick and Louise had no children. The Oldenburg line was going to die with him. The vultures were circling. Prussia, Austria, the distant cousins in the Glucksburg line. The king, sensing the end of his dynasty and perhaps the end of his own sanity, threw himself deeper into his escapism. He stopped reading state papers. He stopped listening to his advisors. He listened only to Louise and the bottom of the bottle. But even in this decline, there were moments of bizarre, transcendent humanity. One winter, a group of fishermen were lost in a storm near the castle. Frederick, drunk and half-dressed, ran down to the beach. He tried to launch a boat himself to save them. His guards had to physically restrain him. He stood on the shore, weeping and screaming into the wind, offering his entire kingdom for the life of a single sailor. It was scenes like this that kept the myth alive. The people heard about the king who cried for the fishermen. They didn't hear about the king who passed out at dinner or the king who threw a vase at his wife. They chose the legend because the reality was too sad to bear. As the 1850s wore on, the darkness was closing in. The political situation in Schleswig was heating up again. The politicians needed a leader, but they had a mascot. The wife needed a husband, but she had a patient. And Frederick? He just wanted another drink, another dig in the dirt, and for the voices in his head to stop. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy. The scandals were about to turn into disasters, and the eccentricity was about to turn into madness. Twilight descends on Jägerspri's castle, casting long, melancholy shadows across the overgrown grounds. Inside, the lamps are trimmed low, but the air is heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and unspoken dread. Frederick sits in his armchair, his face a map of broken capillaries, his breathing wet and labored. Opposite him sits Louise, her needle flashing through her embroidery, her face a mask of iron will. They are the rulers of Denmark, yet they are utterly alone. The court in Copenhagen is a viper's nest plotting their ruin. The family is estranged. The elite are laughing. Frederick's trembling hand claws for the crystal decanter on the table. Louise's hand intercepts it instantly. "Not tonight, Fritz," she says, her voice low but unbreakable. "We have the council tomorrow." "The council?" he wheezes, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "What do they want now? To take my dogs, to banish my wife?" "No," she replies, her eyes dark. "The Prime Minister is coming, and he brings bad news." Frederick withdraws his hand. He stares at the blackened window, seeing his own reflection. A bloated, frightened ghost trapped in a uniform that no longer fits. "Let them come," he whispers to the glass. "I gave them freedom. Surely that is enough." But in the cold, sober corner of his mind that the brandy can no longer drown, he knows it is not. The dead is being called in, the party is ending, and the hangover is about to kill him. By the mid-1850s, Denmark was a nation suffering from a profound identity crisis, a schizophrenia that mirrored the fractured mind of its king. Geographically, it was one kingdom, but spiritually there were two distinct Denmarks. There was the Denmark of the Copenhagen elite, the officers' mess, and the university salons, a world of whispered contempt where King Frederick VII was viewed as a dangerous embarrassment and his wife Countess Danner as a social leper. And then there was the Denmark of the tenant farms, the fishing villages, and the provincial market squares, a world where Frederick was a demigod, the giver of the Constitution, a benevolent father figure who had broken the chains of absolutism and married a woman of the people. To survive the icy rejection of the capital, Frederick and Louise turned their backs on the court and took their show on the road. They embarked on endless royal tours that resembled less a state procession and more a traveling carnival. The court of the outcasts moved from town to town, a caravan of carriages filled with dogs, servants, archaeological digging equipment, and cases of cheap wine. These tours were the fuel that kept Frederick's fragile ego alive. In the provincial towns of Jutland and Funen, the reception was hysterical. When the king's carriage rolled into a village, the labor stopped, the church bells rang, and the people cheered until their throats were raw. For Frederick, this adulation was a drug more potent than the schnapps he consumed in staggering quantities. He fed off the energy of the mob. He would throw protocol to the wind, stopping the procession to accept a pipe from a farmer or to lift a child into the air. He was performing the role of the people's king with a desperate manic intensity, needing the applause to drown out the silence he faced at home, and sitting beside him, frozen in a rictus of triumphant pride, was Countess Danner. For Louise, these tours were a vindication. In Copenhagen, she was invisible. Here, the local dignitaries bowed low enough to touch the dirt. She played the part of queen with a ferocity that bordered on parody, wearing velvets too heavy for the summer heat, and diamonds too large for daylight, waving with a regal stiffness that contrasted sharply with Frederick's bear-like looseness. She knew that every cheer for her was a physical blow to the snobs who despised her. Yet even in these moments of triumph, the king's eccentricity danced on the edge of madness. During one famous visit to a coastal town, Frederick, swept up in the music and the drink, snatched the baton from a band conductor and began to flail wildly, forcing the musicians to play faster and faster until the national anthem devolved into a chaotic polka. The crowd laughed, thinking it a grand joke from their beloved monarch, while the local officials sweated in terror, fearing the king might topple from the podium. Behind the scenes, the nerves were constant. Frederick traveled with a doctor and a mobile pharmacy, his co-jerk psychological episodes, sudden violent tremors, or fits of irrational rage, becoming harder to conceal. Louise managed them with the efficiency of a lion tamer, knowing exactly when to steer him away from the public eye or when to signal the carriage to drive on, shielding the myth from the reality. While the king played the populist hero in the provinces, the political sharks in Copenhagen were circling around the unspoken crisis of the succession. Frederick and Louise had no children, and the main Oldenburg line was destined to die with him. The crown would pass to a distant cousin, Christian of Glucksburg, whose household, known as the Yellow Palace, stood in stark contrast to Frederick's chaotic court. The Glucksburgs were a model of Victorian propriety, sober, boring, and financially modest. They were the perfect family, waiting in the wings for the disaster to exit the stage. Frederick detested them. He hated their perfection, their sobriety, and the fact that they represented the future, while he, despite his popularity, represented a dead end. He treated Prince Christian with petty rudeness, often excluding him from state functions, driven by the jealousy of a man who knows he is being replaced. This tension between the decaying past and the waiting future exploded quite literally on a freezing night in December 1859. Frederiksborg Castle, the magnificent Renaissance palace that served as the primary royal residence and a symbol of the dynasty's history, caught fire. The blaze began with a faulty fireplace. Though rumors persisted it was the king's own carelessness with a pipe, and spread with terrifying speed through the drafty, timber-filled halls. The destruction of Frederiksborg became the perfect metaphor for Frederick's reign, a magnificent structure consumed by negligence and chaos. When the alarm was raised, the castle descended into bedlam. The king and Countess Danner were evacuated into the snow, shivering in their nightclothes. But then, the old Frederick, the physical, reckless man, took over. Ignoring the pleas of his guards, the king tried to rush back into the burning building. He was not trying to save state papers or the crown jewels. He was trying to save his collection. Frederick's obsession with archaeology had filled the castle with a horde of artifacts, old flints, rusted swords, and stuffed birds that he valued above all else. Witnesses described a scene of apocalyptic absurdity, the great tower of the castle acting as a torch against the night sky, the lake reflecting the inferno, and the King of Denmark, soot-stained and manic, cradling a prehistoric pot like a baby, weeping for his lost toys, while the history of his ancestors melted on the walls. The fire burned away the last of his vitality. After 1859, he retreated further from public life, isolating himself at Jägerspies and Glücksburg Castle in northern Germany. He became older, heavier, and profoundly sadder. His health began to collapse under the weight of a lifetime of abuse. His liver was ravaged, but the immediate threat was his circulation. He suffered from erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection that caused painful red rashes and high fevers, a condition made dangerous by his weakened immune system. As his body failed, his mind grew darker. The paranoia that Louise had managed for years began to slip its leash. He saw enemies in every shadow, convinced that the politicians were plotting to divorce him from Louise, or that the Prussians were planning to invade his bedroom. Louise responded by tightening her grip, becoming the dragon at the gate. She controlled access to the monarch absolutely. Ministers were turned away, generals were kept waiting for days. The Camarilla, the small circle of sycophants who surrounded the countess, became the de facto government of Denmark, making decisions over card games while the king stared vacantly into the fire. This isolation was disastrous because the wolves were at the door. In the south, Otto von Bismarck had risen to power in Prussia. Bismarck was a man of blood and iron, a cold, calculating genius who saw Denmark not as a neighbor, but as a convenient stepping stone to German unification. He was looking for an excuse for war, a pretext to seize the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Denmark needed a statesman to navigate this existential crisis. Instead, it had a dying eccentric hiding in a castle, shielded by a former milliner who was busy settling scores with the Copenhagen elite. The tragedy of Frederick VII was that his greatest strength, his connection to the common people, was useless in the arena of high diplomacy. The peasants of Jutland would die for him, but they could not stop the Prussian artillery. The king's bluster, his refusal to back down, his drunken toast to Danish victory, all the things that made him a hero at home, were poison on the international stage. He was writing checks that his army could not cash, fueled by a delusion of invincibility that the cheering crowds had fed him for a decade. In the autumn of 1863, the endgame began. The Danish government, pushed by nationalistic fervor and the king's own stubbornness, prepared a new constitution that would bind Schleswig closer to Denmark, a direct violation of international treaties. It was the provocation Bismarck had been praying for. War was inevitable, but the king would not be there to fight it. Frederick traveled to Glucksburg Castle in November 1863. He was 55 years old, but he looked 80. His face was a map of broken veins, his breathing a painful wheeze. He had gone there to hunt, to forget, to pretend that the world wasn't ending, but the nerves were gone, replaced by a terrible lethargy. He sat by the fire, shivering, wrapped in blankets, complaining of a cold that the schnapps could no longer touch. The final days of the scandalous eccentric were approaching. The man who had stumbled onto the throne, who had accidentally saved the monarchy, and who had defiantly loved the wrong woman, was about to leave his country alone in the dark. On November 14, 1863, the wind howled around the stone towers of Glucksburg Castle, but inside, the silence was heavier than any storm. In the royal bedchamber, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and camphor. King Frederick VII lay in the great bed, his massive frame reduced to a heap of feverish flesh, the erysipelas having returned to claim him. His face was swollen and angry, his mind drifting in and out of delirium. Louise Danner sat by the bedside, her vigil unbroken. The makeup was gone, the jewels were put away. She was no longer the countess, no longer the dragon. She was simply a wife, watching her husband die. She held his hand, feeling the heat of the fever, knowing that the only person who had ever protected her was slipping away. There were no speeches, no grand final words of statecraft. There was only the labored breathing of a man who had lived too hard and loved too recklessly. As the king's grip loosened, a terrifying reality settled over the room. He was leaving behind a kingdom on the brink of slaughter. He was leaving behind a wife who had no allies. The scandalous eccentric was drifting into history, and outside the castle walls, the Prussian cannons were being wheeled into position, ready to punish the nation for the sins of its beloved, broken king. The death of King Frederick VII on November 15, 1863, was not merely the end of a life, it was the pulling of a pin from a grenade that had been sitting in the lap of Europe for a decade. As the king took his final rattling breath in the gloom of Glucksburg Castle, the machinery of disaster began to whir into motion. He had died at the absolute worst possible moment, leaving his successor, Christian IX, with a constitutional crisis, a hostile Prussia mobilizing on the border, and a grieving nation that expected miracles. Frederick had spent his reign drinking toast to Danish invincibility, feeding the public a diet of nationalist fantasy. Now, he had quietly exited the stage, leaving the bill to be paid in blood by young men who had believed his bluster. The news of the king's death hit Copenhagen like a physical blow. The city went into a state of shock. People wept openly in the streets, mourning not just the monarch, but the man they felt they knew, the jovial, bear-like figure who had given them freedom. But in the ministries and the barracks, there were no tears, only cold panic. The Constitution of November, the document that bound Schleswig to Denmark and defied the German powers, was waiting on the desk for the royal assent. Frederick had promised to sign it. Now the pen was in the hand of the new king, Christian IX, a man who knew that signing it meant war, and refusing to sign it meant a revolution at home. Trapped between the mob and the Prussians, Christian signed, and the sky fell. The Second Schleswig War of 1864 is the dark, bloody shadow that hangs over Frederick VII's legacy, though he was not alive to see it. It was a slaughter. The Danish army, brave but poorly equipped and led by generals fighting a 19th century war with 18th century tactics, was crushed by the industrialized efficiency of the Prussian war machine. The invincibility that Frederick had boasted about evaporated in the freezing mud of Dibble. The cannons he had neglected failed. The fortifications he had ignored crumbled. In a matter of months, Denmark lost a huge share of its territory and a significant portion of its population after 1864. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were gone, taken by Bismarck to forge the new German Empire. The irony of this catastrophe was bitter. The people did not blame Frederick, the man whose chaotic diplomacy and stubborn nationalism had provoked the war. They blamed Christian IX, the German king, who'd inherited the mess. Frederick remained the hero king in the popular imagination, frozen in time as the victor of 1848, while his successor was spat upon in the streets for losing the war of 1864. Frederick had achieved the ultimate populist trick. He took the credit for the sunrise and died just before the storm. While the nation bled, another tragedy was playing out in the private chambers of the royal family. The death of the king meant the social death of his wife, Countess Danner. For 13 years, Louise had been protected by the physical presence of the king. His broad shoulders had been the wall between her and the hatred of the establishment. The moment he died, the wall was gone. The reaction of the court was swift and vindictive. They wanted her gone. They wanted her erased. The new queen, Louise of Hesse-Kassel, made it clear that there was no place for the milliner in the new regime. The politicians, whom Louise had bullied and fired during the king's reign, emerged from the woodwork, demanding retribution. There was talk of stripping her of her title, of challenging the king's will, of seizing her assets. But Louise Danner was not a woman to be crushed easily. She was a survivor of the Copenhagen slums, a woman who had fought her way up from nothing. She possessed a toughness that the aristocrats underestimated. She knew the law, and she knew where the money was. Frederick, in his final years, perhaps realizing what would happen, had ensured she was financially independent. He had left her wealthy. The funeral of Frederick VII was the final battlefield. The court protocol was manipulated to marginalize her. She was the widow, the king's wife in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of the state, she was an embarrassment. She was forced to walk behind the royal family, isolated in her grief, stared at by the very people who had whispered about her for a decade. Yet, she walked with her head high, her face hidden behind a heavy mourning veil, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. After the funeral, she was effectively exiled from the capital. She retreated to Jägersbris Castle, the sanctuary she and Frederick had built together. The castle, once filled with the chaotic noise of Frederick's court of outcasts, fell silent. Louise was alone. She was 58 years old, hated by the upper class, childless, and widowed. It would have been easy for her to wither away, to become the mad woman in the attic, consumed by bitterness. But the scandalous eccentric narrative had one final twist. Louise Danner decided to rewrite her ending. She looked at the vast fortune Frederick had left her, the money that the snobs said she had stolen, and she decided to use it for something that would make her name immortal in a way a title never could. She turned Jägersbris not into a shrine to herself, but into a home for those who had started life just as she had, the unwanted, the poor, the illegitimate. She established the Frederick VII's Foundation for poor girls of the working class. She converted the wings of the castle into an orphanage and a school. This was not the distant check-writing charity of a bored aristocrat. Louise was involved. She was the matriarch. She saw herself in these girls, daughters of maids and washerwomen, girls whom society viewed as disposable. She gave them education, she gave them dowries, and most importantly, she gave them dignity. She ran the foundation with the same iron will she had used to run the king's household. She was strict, she was demanding, but she was fiercely protective. In the final decade of her life, a strange transformation occurred. The whore and the witch became the benefactress. The people of the surrounding countryside, who had always loved Frederick, transferred their loyalty to his widow. They saw her walking in the park of age.This, a small stout figure in black, and they tipped their hats not out of fear, but out of respect. The aristocracy in Copenhagen still sneered, but their sneers rang hollow against the reality of the lives she was saving. Louise Danner outlived her husband by 11 years. She died in 1874. In her will, she left age.This castle and her entire fortune to the foundation, ensuring that her work would continue long after she was gone. She asked to be buried in the garden of the castle, in an open-air tomb that mimicked the ancient burial mounds Frederick had loved so much. She did not want to be in Roskilde Cathedral with the kings and queens who had despised her. She wanted to be with Frederick's spirit under the open sky, in the place where they had been happy. Her death marked the true end of the era of the scandalous eccentric. The wild, boozy, chaotic energy of Frederick's reign was buried with her. Denmark had moved on. It was now a smaller, humbler nation, chastened by the War of 1864, ruled by the respectable Christian IX. The scars of the loss of Schleswig-Holstein began to heal, turning into a cultural introspection that gave birth to the modern Danish welfare state, a state built on the very egalitarian principles that Frederick had accidentally unleashed. But the ghost of Frederick VII refused to fade. While historians and generals cursed his name for the lack of military preparation, the common people refused to let go of their hero. Statues of Frederick went up in town squares across Denmark. They didn't depict him as the bloated, dying man at Glücksburg. They depicted him as the vigorous, smiling monarch of 1848, hand extended, giving the Constitution to his people. This disconnect between the historical reality and the popular memory is the defining legacy of his life. Frederick VII was a man who failed at almost everything he tried to do. He failed at marriage twice. He failed at being a traditional king. He failed to prevent the dismemberment of his kingdom. But he succeeded at the one thing that monarchs rarely achieve. He became human. He was the mirror in which the Danish people saw themselves, not the idealized, perfect self, but the real self. Flawed, fond of a drink, sentimental, stubborn, and deeply democratic. They forgave him his sins because his sins were their sins. They loved him because he was not above them. He was of them. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story of the king and the milliner settled into legend. The anger faded, leaving behind a bittersweet romance. It became a story about two damaged people who found each other in the wreckage of a rigid society and held on for dear life. It was a story of a king who would rather be a blacksmith and a commoner who had to be a queen. But there is one final chapter to this story, a reckoning with the psychological toll of such a life. To truly understand Frederick, we must look not at the statues, but at the man who stood on the beach weeping for the fishermen. We must look at the nerves, the shakes, the desperate need for escape. The scandalous eccentric was not just a colorful character. He was a tragedy of biology and circumstance. He was a man crushed by the weight of a crown he never wanted, a man who burned his life as fuel to keep the shadows at bay. If you stand today in the center of the Christiansborg Palace Square in Copenhagen, you will find yourself in the shadow of a massive equestrian statue. High upon a bronze horse sits King Frederick VII. He is frozen in a moment of supreme calm, his right hand extended in a gesture of benevolent command, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on a horizon of eternal glory. The inscription on the plinth calls him the giver of the Constitution and the people's friend. It is a magnificent piece of propaganda, a heavy metal assertion of stability and strength, but it is also a lie. The man on the horse never existed. The real Frederick could barely sit on a horse in his final years without swaying from drink or fever. The real Frederick did not command with a steady hand. He signed documents with a trembling quill to make the shouting stop. The statue is the king that Denmark wanted. The history underneath it is the king that Denmark got. Yet this discrepancy between the bronze idol and the flesh and blood wreck is not a failure of history. It is the very essence of Frederick's enduring power. As the decades turned into a new century, and the raw wounds of the 1864 defeat began to scar over, the Danes made a collective, psychological choice. They chose to remember the gift and forget the cost. They chose to canonize the scandalous eccentric, not because he was a great ruler in the traditional sense, but because he was the accidental architect of their modern soul. The legacy of Frederick VII is a paradox that continues to baffle political scientists. How can a monarch who practically abdicated his responsibilities, who spent his reign digging in dirt mounds and drinking with stable boys, be the father of Danish democracy? The answer lies in the peculiar nature of his weakness. A stronger king, a man of iron discipline like his Prussian counterparts, would have fought the tide of liberalism in 1848. He would have sent the dragoons into the streets. There would have been blood, barricades, and a legacy of bitterness. Frederick, in his laziness, his anxiety, and his desperate need to be liked, did the one thing that no absolute monarch had ever done willingly. He let go. He surrendered power not out of high-minded philosophical conviction, but out of a human desire for a quiet life. He famously said, "The love of my people is my strength." But one suspects the unspoken second half of that sentence was, "Because I do not have the strength to fight them." In doing so, he created a unique Danish political tradition, where revolution is a conversation rather than a combat, a transition managed with a handshake rather than a guillotine. He made the monarchy survive by making it harmless. But the scandalous eccentric left behind more than just a parliament. He left behind a new definition of what it means to be Danish. Before Frederick, the ideal of the nation was aristocratic, French-speaking, and distant. Frederick smashed that pedestal. He was the first Hygge king, long before the word became a marketing slogan. He embodied a specific Danish archetype, the anti-hero who values comfort, egalitarianism, and a good drink over grandeur and protocol. When Danes look at Frederick, they don't see a remote deity. They see their uncle who tells bad jokes at Christmas, the neighbor who helps you fix your fence but borrows your tools and forgets to return them. He made the monarchy human, and in doing so, he made it bulletproof. However, we must not romanticize the tragedy of the man himself. To look back at Frederick VII is to perform a psychological autopsy on a victim of the royal system. Modern psychiatry would likely look at his nerves, his paranoia, his manic highs, and his depressive lows, and see a textbook case of a mood disorder exacerbated by severe substance abuse disorder. But the root cause was not biological, it was emotional. He was the boy who was abandoned by his mother at age 1, the boy whose father looked at him with cold disappointment, the boy who was raised by servants. He spent 55 years trying to fill a void that was carved out of him in the nursery. The alcohol was not a vice. It was an anesthetic. The eccentricity, the dressing up, the barking orders, the frantic digging for artifacts was a desperate attempt to find an identity that wasn't the prince. When he was digging in a burial mound covered in mud, holding a Stone Age axe, he wasn't the disappointment of the Oldenburg line. He was a discoverer. When he was drinking with the sailors, he wasn't the incompetent statesman. He was Fritz, a good man, who bought the next round. His entire life was a flight from the throne he was forced to sit on. And then there is Louise Danner. History has been slow to apologize to the milliner, but the vindication when it came was absolute. For a century, she was the villainess, the Lady Macbeth who led the king astray. But looking through the lens of modern understanding, Louise emerges as the true hero of the saga. She was not a manipulator, she was a caregiver. She took a man who was falling apart and held him together for 13 years. She was the only person in the kingdom who saw the human being beneath the sash and the stars. The Jägerspriest Foundation stands today as her monument. It is not a statue of bronze, but a living legacy of care. While the politicians who mocked her are forgotten, the institution she built to save poor and unfortunate girls continued its work for over a century. Louise Danner proved that nobility is not found in bloodlines, but in action. She took the hatred of a nation and turned it into charity. In the end, the whore did more for the people than the queens who came before her. The love story of Frederick and Louise remains one of the most compelling and subversive in royal history. It was a rejection of the fairy tale. It was a marriage of two damaged people who created a sanctuary in a hostile world. They were the original modern royal couple, insisting that personal happiness mattered more than dynastic duty. When Frederick threatened to abdicate rather than lose her, he was asserting a radical individualism that was terrifying to the 19th century mind, but is deeply moving to the 21st century heart. As we close the book on the scandalous eccentric, we are left with a final haunting image. It is not the image of the king on the balcony, nor the king on the battlefield. It is the image of the king in the final months of his life, sitting in his study at Jägerspriest. The walls are covered in his archaeological finds, flints, skulls, rusted swords. He is holding a pipe, his hand shaking slightly. He is looking out the window at the gray Danish sky, a man who knows he has failed to stop the coming war, a man who knows his body is failing him. He is the king who gave his people freedom because he knew the crushing weight of chains. He is the king who wanted to be ordinary in a world that demanded he be extraordinary. Frederick VII was a disaster of a monarch. He was erratic, irresponsible, and fundamentally unsuited for power. By all objective metrics, he was a failure. And yet, if you ask the Danish people, he was the greatest of them all. He taught a small, battered nation that it is okay to be flawed. He taught them that dignity is not about stiff collars and perfect French, but about kindness, solidarity, and the courage to be yourself, even when the whole world is laughing. The bronze statue in the square may be a lie, but the sentiment behind it is real. Frederick VII was the king who couldn't rule himself, but in his weakness, he set his people free. And perhaps in the grand, messy calculus of history, that is enough. The scandalous eccentric rests now not in the cold marble of the cathedral nave where the tourists walk, but in the quiet earth of the Danish imagination. A broken man who became a beloved myth, holding a glass of schnapps in one hand and the Constitution in the other, toasting a future he would never see, but which he, in his stumbling, drunken way, made possible.